Did you know that there were 86 commercial plane accidents last year? That's what I read in the airport lobby before I boarded my plane. Needless to say, it made me even more nervous. It was my first time flying, and reading about plane crashes really wasn't helping. I stopped for a slight moment before stepping into the plane with a shaky leg. The flight attendant flashed me a blinding white smile and asked me for my plane ticket. I gave it to her with sweaty hands. She took a look at it and pointed me inside the cabin. My nerves filled my legs with jittery energy, and the crammed cabin did not help that. I found my seat, and thankfully it was a window seat. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and looked around to make sure no one saw me. I didn't want anyone to laugh at me. I hurriedly sat down on my seat and took deep breaths. My chest rose and fell, but my heart continued beating relentlessly, and the sweat wouldn't stop forming on my forehead. The hum of the plane engines filled the atmosphere a couple of minutes later, and a lump formed in my throat as the plane accelerated. I could feel the pressure on my chest as the plane moved faster and faster. Just before the plane started to ascend, the front part of the plane went up and then fell again, causing a loud thud. I yelled as I heard the thud. A child behind me started to laugh before his mother shushed him. My face flushed red with embarrassment, and I shut my eyes tightly. I sensed the plane going higher and higher as the pressure on my chest started to increase. My chest tightened, and I was afraid the pressure was going to crush me. Nothing like that happened though, and the plane stopped descending after a couple of minutes and just started to fly forward. I unbuckled my seatbelt with shaky hands as my adrenaline rush wore off. The same flight attendant from earlier offered me a bottle and asked me if I was okay. I mumbled no, and quickly took the bottle. I stared at the white clouds from the window as the plane continued to soar in the air. Soon it got boring, and I was now more bored than nervous. Flying isn't so bad after all, I told myself as I started to look for a movie to watch on the screen in front of me. Instead, I opted out for some games and just played those instead on the remote. They weren't exactly exciting games, but they kept me entertained for the next 30 minutes. Soon enough, the lights in the cabin were turned off, and only dim blue lighting filled the cabin. Most people tried to go to sleep in the cramped seats. I decided to do the same as I wanted to just pass time. That was the worst decision I made. When I was just on the edge of sleep, I started to hear faint whispers in the cabin. My half-asleep mind didn't register them, and I fell asleep. That's the last thing I remember before I woke up. I woke up naturally a couple of hours later. I rubbed my tired eyes before looking around the cabin. It was completely empty. I blinked and rubbed my eyes again and again, looking around for anyone. The cabin was still dimly lit with the blue lights, and it was completely empty, like everyone had just vanished. A pit formed in my stomach, and my mouth suddenly went dry. I got out of my seat and started walking down the aisle, moving my head side to side to find someone. My fears were confirmed, and there was no one in the cabin. I moved to the next area via the curtains, and once again, the plane was empty. I checked the toilets as well, and there was no one there. Maybe I slept through the landing, I thought, as my mind tried to rationalize the situation. It's ironic how in the most stressful situations, our first priority is to rationalize the situation, to find an explanation. I went to a window and pulled up the plastic window cover. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the dark sky and the faint outlines of whiskey clouds. Chills ran up my spine as my observation started to register. I was all alone on a plane 10,000 meters up in the air. I started running quickly to the pilot's cabin. I ran past multiple cabins separated by curtains and the toilets. I ran and ran, but all I saw on the other side of the separating curtains was another cabin. I was sweating profusely. My heart was a scared rabbit trapped in my chest. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many cabins I crossed, I never reached the pilot's cabin. Every window showed the same dark sky and clouds. Every cabin was lit by the same dim blue lights. Every cabin had the small dark blue carpet. I collapsed in the middle of the aisle as I crossed my 30th seating cabin. I couldn't catch my breath. My clothes were wet with sweat, and the lump in my throat wouldn't go away. I needed to get out of this plane. Suddenly I heard a low hum, different from the hum of the plane engine. I strained my ears. It had a melody, a rhythm. It sounded serene and sad. I looked around and saw a woman sitting on a seat a couple of rows ahead of me. I could only see the back of her head. I got up and walked towards her, desperate for help. I stopped in my tracks when I saw what she was watching on her screen. It showed me behind her, like there was a camera behind me and it was streaming to her screen. She stopped humming and turned her head around slowly. Her face turned the blood in my veins into ice. She was the same flight attendant. Her eyes were bloodshot and her eyelids were missing. Her mouth was curled into a smile that spread from ear to ear. "Is there a problem, sir?" she spoke in her calm voice. I stumbled backwards and nearly fell over before running without looking back. I kept on running and running until I tripped over and crashed into a soft, dark carpet. I looked back and noticed that I had tripped on a bottle, the same one that the flight attendant had given me before I fell asleep. What does she want from me? I thought as I slowly got up and looked behind me for the first time. Thankfully, she had not followed me, and I was alone in the cabin. I looked around and pondered on what I should do. I had no way out. The curtain to the next cabin ahead of me fluttered and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The flight attendant came out from behind the curtain. "Is there a problem, sir?" I stuttered as I slowly backed away. I hit into a solid object. I turned around and came face to face with the same exact flight attendant again. "Is there a problem, sir?" I looked back and suddenly all the seats were full. They were all twins of the same flight attendant. "Is there a problem, sir? Is there a problem, sir?" Their voices echoed through the whole cabin. Their voices shook me to the very core. I ran to the next cabin quickly and noticed that that cabin too was filled with the flight attendants. I continued running until I found myself facing an exit door. The flight attendants were following me. I could hear the drumming of their footsteps. I quickly opened the heavy door by turning the wheel. I would rather jump off the plane than face them. The door opened and I suddenly sucked into the blackness of the sky. It was cold. The chill creeped into my bones and into my very soul. I continued falling into the dark sky through the clouds. I waited for my horrible death. I waited for the moment that I would hit the ground at my terminal velocity and break all the bones in my body. I waited for those short few moments of immense pain. I started to remember what happened before this predicament, how I'd gotten myself into this mess. The memory of me boarding the plane in my mind. I saw myself about to fall asleep and then suddenly, I find it hard to describe, but it's like I just jumped into that memory, like being sucked into it. I was back in my plane seat. My body was still cold and I could still feel the wind rushing in my hair as I fell. Slowly the feelings of me free-falling subsided and I could feel the cabin once again. I was transported back to the time just before I had fallen asleep. Needless to say, I did not fall asleep. A couple of fearful hours later, the plane had finally landed and I was ecstatic to feel the ground again. I had thought up until then that it was just a dream. It was just a nightmare induced by my fear of flying. However, what happened just as I departed from the plane makes me doubt that. The same flight attendant was standing at the door wishing us farewell as they departed. When I passed in front of her, she said something that makes chills run up my spine to this very day. "Is there a problem, sir?" I quickly ran out of the flight and pushed past everyone. I safely got home and I wouldn't be typing up this story just because of the scary flight though. I am posting this because I need help. I saw the flight attendant again today. She's right outside my window. I can't escape my room. No matter how many times I pass through the door, it always leads back again into my bedroom. She has been staring at me as I type this post. I don't think my window can hold her back any longer.